Hi, this is the Everyday Economist, and today I'll be examining the situation and the crisis in Venezuela, but also looking at what a potential military conflict, if it comes to be, will look like. The video is going to be divided into looking at the current situation, how we got here, going back all the way to Trump's first term, the reasons for why America is in an entanglement with Venezuela, and at the end of the video, I'll show and conclude what my personal predictions are based on the analysis I've done on what the type of military engagement will look like if it comes to be, and what are the assets and the real reasons and targets included in and involved in it. Let's begin. And to begin looking at the current situation, as I'm sure you've seen in the news for the past few months, the United States has been taking airstrikes against speedboats in the Caribbean and releasing the footage and stating that those are drug-related boats that the United States is defending in the shipment of drugs into their continental borders. And that's just part of it, because as we can see in the photo, this is a massive and unprecedented buildup of both naval and air assets in and around the Caribbean region, but also the Gulf of Mexico, completely surrounding Venezuela from all sides. It's kind of like a naval blockade. It even includes various strike groups and even nuclear submarines from what I've seen reported. And the point here is that in total, when we take an aggregate view, this is unprecedented because close to 11,000 troops have been deployed between the USS Gettysburg that's on the way, the USS Erie, and the various other strike groups in the region. And it's unprecedented because the last time this happened was in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for a sense of perspective, you can understand and appreciate how this is unique in the context of history, at least as it concerns this region. And we also see that the external show of force through the Navy and the military is also going hand in hand with recent reporting that we've seen on covert actions going on behind the scene. We see that the Trump administration has authorized CIA action, and we do see the end results of it. For example, very recently, the U.S. tried to, through some social engineering, manipulate and convince the pilot for Maduro, his personal pilot, to actually divert his plane while he was on it and land in a jurisdiction where they can arrest him. And we see that this is something more serious than just moving a few naval assets in the ocean from one place to another. And it's important to then take a step back and think how we got here. This is not something that's just come out of nowhere or transpired, even despite the recent footage of the speedboats being taken out, them alleging that it's connected to Venezuela. That's just part of the piece. If we go back to Trump's first term, we see that America, and specifically Trump, has had problems with Venezuela. It goes even back further than that to the times of Hugo Chavez, but specifically as the Trump administration is concerned, we saw that in his first term, we had a few show of force against Venezuela, albeit differently. First, we saw there was a drone attack in 2018, and this was the end result of a lot of speaking out of Trump against Venezuela. And it's called a drone attack, but if you see the footage, it's tantamount to an assassination attempt on Maduro. Towards the tail end of his administration, we saw Operation Gideon, which was Trump's so-called allegedly his attempt to use the CIA like a Bay of Pigs sort of thing on a miniature scale to overthrow Maduro. Again, it's alleged, but let's be honest. Nevertheless, it didn't work. And even throughout his administration at the State of the Union, we saw Juan Guaido. You see in the photo there, who's this exiled leader, supposedly, as a replacement for Maduro. That if Maduro is toppled, that this guy would be coming back and leading Venezuela. And Trump actually invited him to the State of the Union, propped him up as a leader, gave him some political capital through that. So we see that this is a longer game being played out. It's not just this recent past few weeks, like the USS Ford being moved. It's going to take several weeks to get there, but even we add that to the current timeline, it goes back much longer than that. And I will also note how this is part of a greater game. If we want a proper analysis, we should understand all the players involved. Because just as we see America repeating its action, we see that Russia is also repeating its actions going back to Trump's first term when they did something that was very provocative, similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. They literally landed nuclear-armed jets in Venezuela as a show of force against the U.S. We see in that article from 6 years ago. And just this week, Russia sent their Ilyushin 76 their four-engine cargo plane, the largest they have in their arsenal, to Venezuela. And that's usually a sign that they're sending some sort of arms and shipments. And that's interesting to note the timing of, because why would Russia do that? Perhaps they have intelligence from their own sources that indicates that this show of force may just be more than a show of force, that there is something afoot here. It's also interesting to note not just the timing, but also the context of why Russia is doing this. Because right now, this week, they launched a major counterattack from a position that Ukraine captured back from their territories in the invasion of their country. And Russia, you would think, in the middle of that counterattack, would be trying to collect and save and use all military resources that they can get their hands on. So for them, in the middle of that entanglement, to then diverge some resources away to Venezuela and have planes land in Caracas, gives you a signal that, wait a minute, what is Russia doing here? Do they know something that the public doesn't? There's probably a greater game afoot here than meets the eye. But why Venezuela still? Despite all of that, why Venezuela? Why is it an object of fascination for Russia, for America, and also China because of their Belt and Road Initiative? Well, Venezuela is located in a very strategic location. From Russia's perspective, it's close to the United States, and it's also a friendly country in a region where they don't have many friends. And we saw how, for example, Russia use Syria as a base of operations to get access to the Mediterranean. They also use Venezuela as a base of operations to get access to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. So geopolitically, it's very beneficial for Russia. From America's perspective, let's put ourselves in America's perspective. If they're looking at a 10, 15-year timeline looking forward, and they're anticipating or at least factoring in a possibility of some sort of direct conflict with China or Russia greater than what they're currently doing now, then Venezuela and by extension Cuba, a close ally of Venezuela, could both prove to be Achilles' heels for America because it is a base of operations for China and Russia. It could be expanded upon and built upon. It could be a launching pad for hostile operations against the U.S. in terms of intelligence, quasi-military, what have you. So from America's point of view, it's very similar to how they view Venezuela, is similar to how China, for example, views Taiwan, or Russia views Ukraine. They could see it as a potential breeding ground for their enemies to come in and do things that they would not find in their interest. So America, in some way, form, or shape, not only has to deal with Cuba, but also take him off the chessboard so that Russia and China don't have access to it. It could be not as much as America having access to it, but rather their adversaries not having access to it. So America is rather forced to confront Cuba and Venezuela from that perspective, not just from the perspective of geopolitics, but also geography. Look how close Cuba is. And you have also very hawkish individuals like Marco Rubio, who's from Cuba, is dear and near to his heart, and his family has a history of being kicked out of Cuba by the Castros. So he can see how Venezuela supports Cuba, and taking out Venezuela is taking out Cuba. So Trump has very loud voices in his ear in this term, unlike the last term where some people were trying to hold him back, in painting Venezuela as a global adversary, not just as a regional one, because of, again, the connections to Cuba, Russia, and China. But perhaps another reason why America, or frankly any nation in the world, would be fascinated by Venezuela is because they are by far have the possession of the world's largest oil reserves. This might be surprising to some people, but it's something I've covered in this channel dating back many years on multiple videos. But Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, Canada, Iran, Iraq, and obviously the United States. So the question is, why are they so poor? Well, here's the irony. The problem is they have the oil in quantity, but they don't have it in quality. Because the type of oil that Venezuela has is so-called viscous, for lack of a better term. And in comparison, Saudi oil or any Gulf nations has oil that is considered far better than Venezuelan oil because it's lighter, cleaner, and easier to refine. For example, Saudi crude, like Arab Light, has a higher API gravity, which in less technical terms means that it's lower in sulfur concentration, and that in turn means that they can naturally and much more easily and cheaply produce more valuable fuels like gasoline and diesel with less processing. So they have economies of scale, but also scope. Venezuelan oil, by contrast, however, is, very thick, like straight out of the ground. It's full of impurities, like sulfur, like I mentioned, and other sort of metals that really contaminate it. So Venezuela needs access to very high-tech uh, industrial grade equipment to refine that oil and make it sellable and put it on the market. And that unfortunately has been a problem for them because of the sanctions and lack of economic development. So they're sitting on a gold mine, or in this case, an oil mine, but they really can't do anything with it. Or someone can and with the proper equipment. Now, you might say, does the US really want the oil? Because as we've seen in my previous videos, the US actually produces more oil than anyone. They're far more efficient than anyone else, despite the fact of not having the most reserves, but making the most out of the current reserves that they have and pumping out the most oil ready to go on the market. However, if you're from the perspective of the United States looking in and looking out, and again, you think about potential conflicts with China, with Russia, with Iran, with other countries in military entanglements, you want to make sure that regardless of how much oil you're producing, you have some in reserves that are going to serve you beyond and above what you would normally need. And we have reports coming out saying that U.S. oil production, although it's at the top, it's going to peak in a couple of short years. And this is from the U.S.'s own EIA. And I've done some napkin math here because a more accurate way to demonstrate this is by looking at reserve to production ratio, which is essentially taking the billions of barrels that you have underground and dividing it by the production ratio, how much you're actually pulling out and putting in a barrel and selling. And if we do napkin math of current numbers, America has a run rate of 10 years going forward. But again, I put a big asterisk there because the reserve to production ratio is quite controversial. It's not as accurate because this is assuming ceteris paribus, all else is equal, America's not going to explore any new oil deposits, the demand's not going to change, everything's going to stay the same, which obviously is wrong. And as we know in America, there's always technological innovations, this shale revolution, and they're always discovering new deposits even today in Louisiana, in Florida, Texas, Alaska. So if we take even a more generous approach, you could say 20, 30, 40 years, even 50 years. But even then, if you're thinking about a potential global conflict or from that sort of point of view, you want to be a penny pincher and save and have this number be as high as possible. So if we add Venezuela's oil reserves, the 300, to America's about 46 billion barrels underground, you're essentially, if we do the math again on napkin, adding 500 additional years just by including Venezuela's oil. And I'm not saying it in terms of like conquest of taking all of America's oil. You could even have friendly oil companies there, like shale or whoever. But that's one point. The other point is, even if you don't want to increase this number from America's perspective, you still want to take Venezuelan oil off the oil market because it denies access to Russia and China and OPEC, who are all in one way, shape, or another adversaries to U.S. So if you want to fight a war, like World War II, the Germans lost, not because the UK had more oil than them, but because the UK and the Allies were able to deny the Germans oil in the Caucasus. So it's again not just about what you have, but also at the same time what you're denying your opponent having. So that's another factor. And even then, you might rightfully still be skeptical about that claim because you could say it's on the verge of conspiracy or it assumes too many factors, and that might be true, but don't take it from me. Take it straight from the horse's mouth. This is actually what Trump himself has said publicly about Venezuelan oil.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it. You know where the oil...
And to be honest, I'm personally skeptical of what Trump usually says publicly, but it's like that old quote going back to describing the Democrats and the Republicans and how you shouldn't worry about what they say when they disagree, but you should definitely pay attention to what they're talking about when both the Democrats and Republicans agree. Same thing here. You shouldn't really pay attention to what Trump says publicly if it disagrees with what he's doing or going privately, but you should definitely get your ears up and pay attention when what he says privately matches up with what he is saying publicly. And what he said publicly in the last slide matches with what he said privately about Venezuela, and we know this from a 2019 book by Andrew McCabe, former FBI deputy director, in his book The Threat. Here, and I quote, he writes, "Then the president talked about Venezuela. That's the country we should be going to war with," he said. "They have all that oil and they're right on our back door." He continued on rambling and spitballing about whatever came to mind. So again, you can see where Trump's mind was going back all the way to the first term, let alone now in his second term when he's emboldened and he doesn't really have to worry about a re-election. Presidents always are more emboldened in their second term. So if this comes to be, let's look at how it's going to happen. So who is the real target? If the United States does get involved in a military engagement with Venezuela, who is the military target? From the videos we've seen of the speedboats, America, both Pete Hegseth and Trump on Twitter, the speedboats are alleged to be tied to various cartels, namely and mostly Cartel de los Soles, which is the main cartel in Venezuela. They are involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and money laundering. This is the target that you will see in the headlines if this thing continues. In my view, the real target is definitely going to be the colectivos, which again, just like the Cartel de los Soles, are a quasi-cartel and gang, but they also have a secondary and important function that's really understated in the headlines, is that they're Maduro's basically SS, personal bodyguard, so to speak. They're a key instrument of his dictatorship, and they have a history of protecting him, cracking down on both in the military, the fringes that don't agree with Maduro, but also and namely the peaceful protesters who came out in many marches from 2017 and onwards against Maduro's dictatorship. And so they're a political enforcer, so to speak. But it's a very convenient way for Trump, if his real name is regime change, to post videos on the internet saying, you know, we took out a speedboat, it was Cartel de los Soles, but it could also be the colectivos, because if you take the colectivos out, that's the front that's basically protecting Maduro. But from in terms of framing, who can really tell which is which? So if Trump's going after the cartel and he really wants to take out Colectivos assets, he can easily do that. And then once he has footage of it, post it on X or Twitter and say we took out the cartel, or vice versa. It's very easy to move these around because from the air they do look the same, but also they're in similar circles. People in the Colectivos could be in the cartel, but from a geopolitical point of view, the Colectivos are more of an important target. And if the U.S. takes this out, you can see that their aim is going to be regime change. Let's look closer at that and how that's going to play. So the aim here is, if you go after the colectivos, you're basically going after this bottom support structure that's propping up Maduro. These are people who are essentially enforcers and supporters and key players in Maduro's dictatorship. And we see that this individuals related to the cartel or colectivos, if they're taken out, essentially Maduro is like a house of cards. It's going to crash crumbling down his regime. So again, it's very easy for Trump to say I'm going after the cartel, but in reality target another group that from the perspective of media reporting is basically the same. You can't really tell them apart from the air, from military footage, it's very easy to sell to the media that you're going after the cartel if you're taking out the colectivos and vice versa. So the aim again is to take out the leadership structure, if that's what the goal is here from all the signals that I've been seeing, to really topple Maduro. But interestingly, this is what the Miami Herald reported just 2 days ago, and Marco Rubio interestingly came out and said, your sources claiming to have knowledge of the situation tricked you into writing a fake story. So he's calling fake news on this. Maduro's saying, no, we're not going against Maduro's regime. And he's holding the line that we're going after the cartel. So who's telling the truth? Well, let's see. On one hand, you have the Miami Herald. And you might say, well, who's the Miami Herald? It's not the New York Times or Washington Post. Who's even heard of the Miami Herald? Well, for one thing, the Miami Herald it's a Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper, and it's actually well known. And also, in terms of their source, they're located in Miami. You might say, well, wouldn't the Miami Herald, who broke this story that the Trump administration is going after Maduro rather than just the cartel, wouldn't the source probably be located in Washington? Wouldn't like the Washington Post reported? They're closer to the Pentagon or DC. Well, the United States Southern Command is actually located in Miami-Dade. And that's where the Miami Herald is. So it's very likely, in terms of how it played out, someone from this leaked the story to the Miami Herald. So in terms of credibility, they have credibility. In terms of source, it makes sense. But also, let's look at the past history, because Marco Rubio is the same guy who came out and said, and along with Trump, who also denied that they're going after Maduro. They both denied, saying that we sent supersonic bombers to Venezuela a few weeks ago when their transponders were accidentally on, and they failed to report that, so they were caught lying. Now, were their transponders on by accident? I don't think so. I think the ideal situation for Trump is to scare the Maduro military into committing a coup or defecting against them, because they're saying we're going to come after you, and if they don't, then finally start doing military strikes, kind of like what they did to Iran. But in terms of who's lying, I don't believe Marco Rubio, because for another fact is, if you pay attention to the Twitter account he posted it from his personal account, not from his secretary account, which is interesting, because is he speaking in a personal sense, calling it a fake news story, rather than from his official post as Secretary of State, so he can have some plausible deniability? Who knows? But now let's look at the most likely outcome of how this thing is going to look out in my personal prediction. So again, the most likely outcome is, I do think there will be likely some sort of more military engagements, further strikes in the ocean, but also even on the mainland Venezuela, because the USS Gerald Ford is on its way. It's going to be arriving in about 2 to 3 weeks, so I don't expect anything in the next few days, but potentially in 3 weeks and a month, likely even by December or early next year, this could be a drawn-out process. And I don't think, like some people are saying, that this is going to be a boots-on-the-ground type of situation. There might be very limited military deployment, boots on the ground. If there is, it's going to be on the coast. I don't think the U.S. is going to get entangled in a long Iraq or Afghanistan-style invasion. I think the ideal goal, for looking at all the evidence that we've examined so far, that Trump is going to do like an in and out, like he's done in everywhere else in his second term right now. A Libya-Yemen situation, so to speak, but with a scare prequel, which I meant was, in the previous slide I said, he's trying to scare the Maduro government into committing a coup by encircling it. His best case scenario is that Maduro is going to be taken out by the Venezuelans and he doesn't have to do anything. Because after all, Trump is, again, he doesn't like prolonged military engagements. He does like military engagements, but just not prolonged ones, because he likes a quick victory. So his ideal case is that there's going to be a coup in Venezuela, Maduro gets toppled, and that's why he's trying to use the CIA defecting and paying this group and that group to, at least some of his generals will likely defect, and trying to scare him into defecting. There's, I promise you, a very heavy CIA-style operation ongoing as we speak. Messaging, sending text to generals, trying to intimidate them, scare them, saying you have to do this, do that, social engineering games, what have you. We saw this in Lebanon, we saw this in Iran, we saw this in Yemen. But the ideal situation is going to be like a NATO strike in Libya in 2011, where they're just going to take out the key organs of the Maduro regime and just see how it plays out, because instability in Venezuela is in America's interest, because it's bad for Russia, it's bad for China, and it's bad for Cuba. So in terms of the actual airstrikes, the strike package could show readiness to strike the key and critical infrastructure, not on government assets per se, but on the colectivos and quasi-military asset that could be both classified as cartel/Venezuelan military, because they're very, if you draw a Venn diagram, they're almost a circle. So we could see airstrikes on ports, airports, and ports, I mean naval ports, airports, warehouses, and sort of the supply line that you see here, which is also the supply line for Maduro's regime, taking any of these things out along the coast. So again, I don't see anything deep into Venezuelan territory, but if there will be strikes, my prediction is this. But it's an interesting situation to see how it plays out, and we can see how this is part of the greater political game that Russia and China are also involved in. So this could also be part of that game as well, where Russia is trying to prop up this regime and Trump is trying to remove one card from Putin and Xi's deck to have further leverage in both negotiations and things. And who knows, maybe part of the negotiations in Trump's visit to China was, if we don't agree on this trade deal, then perhaps Venezuela, your close ally there, could be in trouble. And probably a message was also conveyed to Putin through Xi by Trump at that meeting as well. A lot of speculation, but this is the evidence that it presents, and this is the likely outcome that we can likely see. But that's all for today, and let's see when we can come back to this in a future video. I'll be doing another video on Turkey, and I was about to do a video on inflation and the AI bubble, but a lot of the people who watch this channel sent me Venezuela, so I thought I'll get it out of the way. And if you found this video helpful, please let me know, and I'm always receptive to any suggestions you have, because it's been great